Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module Uniform Civil Code. In this module, first we have to locate the whole debate of Uniform Civil Code in the background of modern Indian history, especially in the way the Constitution of India has been framed. Further, we also need to have an understanding of the terms such as law, religion, gender. Further, we also need to understand how all these concepts operate within this whole idea of democracy as an institution in India and religious fundamentalism growth in India. In doing this module, we will discuss many concepts such as civil codes, colonial modernity, feminist jurisprudence, religious and minority rights, fundamental rights, and especially the whole idea of directive principles of state policy. Uniform Civil Code. Uniform Civil Code are directive principles in the Indian Constitution has been the theme of one of the most intense, intriguing and widespread debate that emerged in India's public life right from the juncture that the Constitution was adopted in 1950. A country with a secular constitution such as India is expected to uphold religious freedom as well as social justice. In this module, we will learn about the UCC, its history and debates surrounding its non-implementation, the issue of gender and law in India, and the controversial question of how to balance religious and personal freedom as well as secularism and social justice. Directive principles in the Constitution are those provisions that are required to be taken into account by the state while making legislations, plan and policies. However, these principles are non-justiciable. Unlike fundamental rights, that is, if they are infringed in any way by the state, no judicial remedy is available to the citizen. The citizens are expected to treat the directive principles as yardsticks of a government's performance while expending their right to vote. The directive principles of UCC appears in Article 44 in the Indian Constitution, advising the state to enact a uniform, undifferentiated set of civil laws throughout the territory of India. It reads, "The state shall endeavour to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India." The idea of UCC is closely tied to the operation of democracy in India, the formation of nationalist discourses, and the disavowed continuity of both this phenomenon with the ideological and administrative apparatus of colonial rule. It also, as one will see, represents the interface of gender issues with democracy, citizenship, and formal equality. Section 1. The legacy of colonialism and the civil code. Colonialism is a project and practice of domination mostly by European Western white powers of land, people and cultures. Indian administrative and legal systems as well as the idea of Indian democracy have been largely derived from the British colonial state. Thus, it is not to suggest that this derivation and or inheritance have been uncritical and uncontested. Cultures of anti-colonial resistance thrived in the British era and thrive today. The concept of colonialism has been expanded to include systems of domination that marginalize large sections of population based on caste, gender, religion, sexuality, language, location and other realities. Thus, the notion of intersectionality of identities and politics is essential to the understanding of the evolution and issues surrounding the UCC. One can refer to the module on intersectionality for a better understanding. UCC is thus just not a legal issue, it is a matter of intersecting identities and ideologies of religion, gender and caste. If you think that UCC is a good idea, you might wonder why the provision on enacting one was placed in the directive principle and not fundamental rights. Tenets of liberal democracy suggest that every citizen of a nation state must have equal legal rights. Yet in the Constitution, which lays down the terms of democracy in India, a distinction is made between rights at the public and rights at the private sphere. This distinction has been inherited from the colonial system and its lawmaking. Colonial law first distinguished between criminal and civil law and placed laws regarding family practices such as marriage, divorce, adoption and inheritance all within civil law. All other laws other than family laws were universally applicable to all subjects. However, family laws were called personal laws and were codified according to religious tenets, a task entrusted to Hindu and Islamic religious authorities. The colonial state also drew a sharp distinction between the private and the public sphere. In the former, the structures of traditional religion and family life were allowed to remain without any state intervention or to stop any oppression of women and children. Interestingly, the colonial state used gender justice and women's issues as a reason to justify colonial rule. For public sphere, strict universal laws about trade, commerce, criminal offences and ownership of property were instituted so that civic and revenue administration becomes easier. The British state had also formed alliances with the religious authorities such as the Brahmanas and the Sarvana caste to facilitate indirect rule and social control. The notion of majority and minority, for instance, is a framework of assessing Indian pluralism constructed during the colonial period and is part of the dominant discourse of colonial modernity. This discourse assigns identities based on religion to various communities for the purposes of maintaining administrative order within a deeply heterogeneous empire. This approach undermines a vast diversity of society in India with its plurality of cultural practices, relegating it instead to a society of just a few contending religious groups. The British institutionalization of tribal identities follow the same logic. The definition of tribe as a culturally distinct from Hindu society as well as from one another hinged on a catalogue of cultural, racial and linguistic traits according to which they were labelled and classified. The anthropological gaze constructed the tribes as a unitary, well-integrated and timeless wholes, unpolluted by contact with the larger civilization until the advent of colonialism. The question of tribes or tribal rights is rarely raised in the debate on UCC. Thus, the British colonial state divided the legal domain into criminal and civil, further dividing the civil into personal and fiscal laws. It codified personal laws with the help of religious authorities. Traditional family laws of Hinduism like Mitakshara and Dayabhaga and Islam, Sharia laws derived from the Quran and Hadith were unified and organized within the codes. The state envisioned gender justice through passing of criminal laws prohibiting atrocious customary practices on women. However, the state was disinterested to reform the religious family laws which are often inequitable and unjust to women. This is related to the way in which colonialism differentiates the rights of individuals in public and private domain. Colonial ideology imposed on Indian society followed the logic of thus the divide and the rule. So, you can imagine how instead of eradicating social stratifications based on gender and caste, these divisions were carefully nurtured by the state to ensure status quo and prevent mass rebellion. This hands-free policy helped an initial commercial agency such as the East India Company to assume power over the vast territories and colonize them substantively and epistemologically. Law as well as strengthening the hand of the Brahmanism was a chief vehicle of this paternalistic control. There was constant effort towards standardizing law for the benefit of the newly introduced colonial juridical structure. The uniformity of colonial logic has left its indelible smear all over the Indian Constitution and debate over UCC. Fast forward to the era of freedom struggle and caste and religion identity politics of the 1930s and 40s, when the Constitution was being framed. Self-identified secular rationalists recognized the differentiation of rights based on caste, tribe and religion. Realizing that such divisiveness would hamper the administration of formal equality and is central to the notion of liberal democracy, the Constituent Assembly envisioned a uniform civil code as a common legislation that would subject all citizens in India to the same code or set of civil laws regardless of their religious, communal, caste, racial or ethnic identities. They also recognized that India had a multiplicity of communities with distinctive religious, linguistic and local traditions. Yet a unified single national identity had to be shaped out of these diversities for the purposes of validating a new sovereign nation. Thus, they demanded that a civil code be created such that no community suffers disadvantage on account of the law having a religious orientation. Not all members of the Constituent Assembly accepted this position, however. Thus, a uniform civil code to govern family laws could not be consensually introduced in the first list of the fundamental rights. After independence, the judiciary was named the mouthpiece of the Indian Constitution. The judiciary used a nationalist welfarist approach to the question of gender justice. In cases pertaining to personal laws, Supreme Court interpreted the religious personal laws in a way that is fair to women. At the same time, it kept advising the state to implement Article 44 and have common family laws for all religious communities. The court reasoned that having a UCC would affect gender justice as well as national unity. However, the independent state maintained the colonial tradition to address women's issues through passing prohibitive laws. The Criminal Procedure of 1974 is a prime example of this. As for Uniform Civil Code, despite efforts, the state till date has not been able to frame it, let alone implement it. Section 2. The ongoing debate on UCC. Any political debate in independent India, such as those on UCC, is couched in terms of binaries in the line with the discourse of colonial modernity. The debates on Uniform Civil Code have always been polarized around the twin axes of state, community, tradition, modernity and religion and secularism, the binaries of colonial modernity. The positions articulated by the judiciary, the Hindu fundamentalists and the feminist movement on the civil code remain locked in the discourse of colonial modernity. We will learn a little bit more on colonial modernity in section 3. The colonial government declared the setting up of a Constituent Assembly for independent India, and this committee was first summoned in 1946. Initially, an advisory committee was set up which would formulate the articles of the Constitution. This advisory committee was further divided into 3 subcommittees, 1 on fundamental rights, 2 on minorities and 3rd on tribal and excluded areas. In 1947, in spite of compelling efforts by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Meenu Masani, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur and Hansa Mehta, members of the subcommittee on minorities, a provision of Uniform Civil Code that was conceptualized as a uniform and egalitarian force was decided by the majority to be outside the scope of fundamental rights. The Uniform Civil Code was to ensure the unified legal subject or citizenship that could resolve the legal conflicts on account of the presence of various religion and religious laws. The provision of Uniform Civil Code was finally put not in the justiciable provisions of fundamental rights but in the non-justiciable directive principles. The first Prime Minister of an independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the first Law Minister, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, continued endorsing the UCC as an instrument of modernization, secularization and national integration. Various legislations were enacted in the 1950s to reform the Hindu personal law. A comprehensive Hindu code bill dealing with marriage and divorce, minority and guardianship, maintenance and adoption and the Mitakshara joint family issues was introduced in the Constituent Assembly by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. This was met by furious objections by legislators and nationalist leaders such as Sardar Patel, J.B. Kripalani and Rajendra Prasad. The latter, who was the first president of independent India, expressed his intention to reserve presidential assent to the bill. At this stage, the supporters as well as dissenters of the Hindu Code Bill invoked the UCC often as the only legitimate device of reform. Those in favor of Hindu personal law reforms refer to the necessity of securing comprehensive, uniform, standardized laws over orthodox, religious and traditional ones, as the deliberations on the UCC, the Constituent Assembly has suggested. Many dissenters reason that reforming the only Hindu laws and leaving Islamic and other laws untouched amounts to minority privilege. Demand for Uniform Civil Code had become a potent tactic for stalling the Hindu Code Bill. There were many court cases that churned up the issue of UCC, but the Muhammad Ahmad Khan versus Shah Bano Begum case of 1985 was the most important case that really recharged the debate. Muhammad Ahmad Khan, the appellant to Supreme Court, had divorced a respondent, his wife Shah Bano, by an irrevocable triple talaq. In April 1978, Shah Bano filed a petition under Section 125 demanding maintenance. The appellant's defense to the respondent's petition was that she had ceased to be his wife. Also, he had paid a maintenance to her at the rate of rupees 200 for 2 years and had deposited a sum of rupees 3000 in the court as mahar during the period of iddat as per as 127(3)(b) of the Islamic personal law. In August 1979, the magistrate directed Ahmad Khan to pay rupees 25 to the respondent as a way of maintenance. In 1980, in a revisional application filed by Shah Bano, High Court of Madhya Pradesh announced the amount of maintenance to rupees 179.20 per month. Ahmed Khan filed an appeal before the Supreme Court by special leave, claiming that Section 125 of the CPC would not apply to him as a Muslim. The court found that the two previous decisions in the Bai Tahira versus Ali Hussain Chothia case of 1979 and Fazal Bui versus Khadarwali case of 1980 upheld that a Muslim wife can apply for maintenance under 125. Yet a bench consisting of Justice Murtaza Fazal Ali and Justice A. Vardarajan considered that those cases were not correctly decided. As a result, they referred to the appeal to a larger bench by an order dated February 3, 1981. Now a reconstituted Supreme Court bench headed by Chief Justice Y.V. Chandrachud on 23 April 1985 dismissed the appeal, confirming the judgment of the Madhya Pradesh High Court, leaving it open for respondent to apply for an enhancement of maintenance allowance. The Supreme Court in effect ruled that Section 125 overrides a Muslim personal law if there arose any conflict between the two. There need not be no conflict, the judgment asserted, citing and interpreting various ayats and surahs of the Quran, that the Muslim husband had to provide for the divorced wife in case of their indigent situations. Apart from that, the court pronounced, it is also a matter of regret that Article 44 of our Constitution has remained a dead letter. There is no evidence of any official activity for framing a common civil code for the country. A common civil code will help the cause of national integration by removing disparate loyalties to law which have conflicting ideologies. No community is likely to bell the cat by making gratuitous concessions on this issue. It is a state which is charged with the duty of securing a uniform civil code for its citizens of the country and unquestionably has a legislative competence to do so. The judgment in favor of Shah Bano was perceived as a judgment against Muslim personal law. The issue of a divorced woman's protection from restitution and meager sum of alimony involved was buried under the waves of resentment against the judgment, perceived as an attack on Muslim religious identity. This case became pivotal in redefining religious identities and majoritarian politics. In the case of overwhelming controversy totally altering the nature of the debate, Shah Bano publicly retracted from the Supreme Court judgment for the cause of being a devout Muslim first. Countrywide agitations led by Indian Union Muslim League, the Muslim Personal Board Law, Jamaat-e-Islami, Jamaat-e-Ulema worried the Congress government led by Rajiv Gandhi. Troubled by the prospect of the loss of Muslim support, the Muslim Women's Protection of Right and Divorce Act 1986 was passed in a hurry despite protests from various women's groups and social justice conscious people from all religious affiliations. The issue was also espoused by the rapidly rising communal groups as a means to impose Hindutva hegemony. With the passing of the Shah Bano judgment and the Muslim Women's Protection of Right and Divorce, the issue of personal law and the Uniform Civil Code became deeply entrenched in combative communal politics. The issue of gender justice was also swept aside. BJP emerged as a strident critique of Rajiv Gandhi's action during the Shah Bano controversy that overturned a secular Supreme Court ruling. It is important to note here that the BJP as well as RSS have always self-consciously placed their contentions in terms of democracy, modernity and secularism. It is related to the problematic of secularism in the Indian Constitution, which can be a tool of minority oppression. If you have followed the politics over the last decades, you will find that both BJP and the Congress have twisted both the notion of secularism to practice divisive communal politics. Today, many women's organizations view the possibility of a UCC as a dubious instrument of Hindutva Brahmanical fundamentalist domination. The movement's focus has shifted from demanding legislations from the state to promoting women's participation in the process of the state and political economy, being part of legislative and other decision making. It is recognized that the autonomous women's movement has been greatly able to render women's issues visible and moved, and such a movement is important in its own right. Formal political participation remains important. Feminists have begun to examine closely the relationship between state and women and legislation. They have identified the problem in the context of the state's ambivalent treatment of women's rights, endowed citizens and gender subjects enmeshed in patriarchal social relations. The root of the problem seems to reside in the nation's constitution that is unable to decide between the import of women's rights and religious community rights. Therefore, as Anupama Rao opines, women's lived experience have had therefore to contend with various superscriptions and circumscriptions. The idealized superscribed woman, pure, chaste with superhuman qualities, purging the body politic, ensnares women within the normative forms of behavior. A unified category of women, a collective body of women as agents and subjects of liberatory change, provides elusive as it happens to hegemonize disparate entities ironically within an abstracted category of women. There is also a realization that passing more and more laws is not a solution to women's problems. This skepticism is captured in Flavia Agner's word: if oppression could be tackled by passing laws, then this decade would have been judged as a golden period for Indian women. Law and awareness raising goes hand in hand. Laws do not change minds and often cannot cause a dent in the centuries of heteropatriarchal, colonial, Brahmanical social structure. Gender justice is also a matter of intersectionality. We cannot think of a uniform category of male or female unless we understand that these categories represent lived experience of people negotiating not just structures of gender, but also caste, class, religion, language, ability and geopolitical location. The experience of a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian or a Sikh woman living in various parts of the country, think about variations in urban and semi-urban areas, experience of living in deeply contested territories in Kashmir and the Northeast, what it means to be a migrant worker, a Dalit student, a North Indian in South India and vice versa, and why these categories and label means will be very, very different. Laws are not innocent nor neutral. They often represent the political will at the heart of a ruling regime. They often represent a political agenda more than justice. With that, let us discuss some basic concepts that will help you to understand the debate on UCC better. Basic concept: Civil Code. Civil Code is understood as law that deals with private matters. The notion of Civil Code arose from the way the colonial state intervened in lawmaking in India. They started by making a sharp distinction between the civil and the criminal laws. Within civil laws, distinction was made between family laws and fiscal laws. Criminal and physical laws replicated English laws, while codification of family laws were left to religious experts. UCC, as you know, is a directive principle in the Indian Constitution that directs the state to ensure that civil code in India is same for all citizens. This is a highly contested position where issues of gender, citizenship and human rights are sometimes swept under the rug, and the dynamics of electoral politics, vote banks and the rise of Hindu fundamentalism and prospects of coercive majoritarianism looms large. Commentators have variously referred to the Uniform Civil Code as Common Civil Code or Equal Personal Law. In legal terminology, a code means a collection or compendium of various laws relating to a particular subject. The Criminal Procedure Code, the Indian Penal Code, the Civil Procedure Code are all examples of codes. Colonial modernity. The notion of colonial modernity is important in understanding how UCC debate has unfolded. Colonial modernity is usually imposed by the colonials, an imperialist entity on spaces colonized for the purpose of social and governmental control. In British India, this has manifested itself in the introduction of English, professional education, law, comprehensive methods of revenue generation, collection, new methods of agriculture aimed solely at farming cash crops. The growth of secondary and tertiary structure in the economy was imposed over the colonial space in the name of modernization and polity. What justified this process of modernization and the seepage of modernity was an unimpeachable claim to rationality. Patel states that colonial modernity approached the society in India with two assumptions. First, relating to distinction and disjunction of those groups living in India from spatial cultural structures of the West and simultaneously creating within India spatial cultural zones. The second was assertion of the boundedness of these groups, now called caste and tribes, constructed in an internally structured hierarchy by a cultural attribute of spirituality emanating from Hindu civilization. A territory was given a religious attribute. Hinduism and India now are collapsed into each other. With the separation of the penal and the personal, the family was affirmed as that of the sacred private site left to heteropatriarchal discretion and customs. This sacred secrecy of the family without any state intervention or regulation conveniently left out the question of gender rights and redressal. Feminist jurisprudence. Feminist legal studies of feminist jurisprudence is emerging as a relatively new area of study in India. Its legal philosophy from a feminist perspective, interrogating the creation and development of laws and legal structure. Feminist jurisprudence places the principles of legal theory and practice on a common canvas to assess its relationship to gender equity and women's day-to-day lives. Feminist jurisprudence and feminist legal studies seek to undermine the liberal universalist claim that law is an objective, neutral truth and exposes its role in systematic oppression of women. However, many scholars also agree that law can offer spaces of resistance within which women can challenge oppressive social relations. The autonomous women's movement in India often approached the issue of UCC from the standpoint of feminist jurisprudence. Conclusion: gender justice or religious freedom. It might seem to you from previous sections that the UCC is a matter of gender justice versus religious freedom, that the implementation of UCC may tamper with many people's religious freedom, provided we think of laws originating in religious texts that are in use in a constitutional democracy as a matter of accommodation and preservation of religious freedom and diversity. What do you think? It is easy to see why many people and groups have thought so. Often under the guise of secularism, women's bodies and lives have been controlled and the religious freedoms taken away. In 2011, France, for instance, banned public use of veils for Muslim women. Belgium and in some cities in Spain also have similar laws. In the 80s, Turkey's secular state enacted a ban on headscarves and full robes. Women in these countries have had to fight for the right to wear hijab and practice religion. A veil does not automatically signify oppression or compliance. Taking away the veil can signify taking away the rights. Groups that are concerned about regressive, oppressive nature of Muslim family laws are often silent about the extremely oppressive nature of the caste system that has long-term effect on innumerable people's safety, rights and well-being. This so-called secular campaign for UCC has provoked religious communities, which in turn has put gender justice in jeopardy. Thus, the notion of religious rights guaranteed by the Constitution has become an issue for the religious right to spread a culture of majoritarianism and minority oppression. Gender justice and women's rights are not exactly priorities for them. Gender justice is again not just a matter of personal laws. Anveshi Research Center on Women's Studies, an organization committed to gender justice and long-time critical feminist voice in the debate, states its position on UCC. The UCC model of legislation, we argued, seemed oblivious to the politics of law reform, implementation issues, women's needs and the Hindu majoritarian agenda. The questions that the Anveshi Law Initiative is engaged with are the conceptual rigidities that attend to the translating of women's needs and concerns into government categories, the relation between gender, minority, caste and law, and the problems related to the preeminence of the rights framework in thinking and activism around violence. If the Uniform Civil Code is implemented, there should be open space for reasonable individual choices. As Conrad points out, that the implementation of a common civil code must imply that religious family laws are not reformed out of existence. An individual may find some elements in these laws that define her rights more suitable than the Uniform Code. Under such circumstances, there must be a provision to choose between family law and a civil code. This choice takes into account that individual rights and also implies that there is no need to be religious national unifying principle. It is thus necessary for the state to intervene as an arbiter to ensure that no matter what cultural practices are being followed, there is no violation of rights of a citizen. For the woman or man or people that do not identify with the gender binary. Beyond that, the state and the law must not dictate the ways in which citizens should maintain relationships, including relationship outside the heteropatriarchal norm, marry or cohabit without marriage, divorce, separate, adopt, bequeath and inherit. It should be outside a democratic state scope to define what is normal and what is not in matter of personal and sexual choices. Its function, rather than to dictate terms of personal life, must be to ensure that there is no unfair exploitation arising out of power asymmetry within personal spaces of citizens. The state protects citizens' right through making and enforcing law instead of using law as an instrument to dominate historically marginalized groups. After discussing and hearing about the module and important debates in the module on Uniform Civil Code in India, we have learnt about the history of Uniform Civil Code in India. Further, we have also understood the political background. And looking at the debate on UCC, we have also analyzed the effect on gender relations. This whole debate of UCC in India also had put focus on the current debate, thereby giving us an idea of the multiple perspectives which has been dealt in the module. We have also looked at the way the whole controversial idea of UCC has played out within the policy or the document of directive principles of state policy. In the end, we have looked at how, using the argument of UCC, how there is politics of lawmaking in India, especially in terms of the debate of communalism, the whole idea of secularism in India, and how all these things has led to an impact on women in India.